Hello, everyone. Today, we're recording a special episode of Exit Wound. If you've listened to our previous episodes, which I highly encourage that you do, you know that we've dug pretty deep into the process of exiting the sex trade and the challenges of rebuilding your life afterwards. And you may have noticed that all of those tough, vulnerable conversations were between women, as 92% of detected sex trafficking victims are women and girls. But this issue doesn't exist in a vacuum. Men are a huge piece of this equation. In this work, we talk a lot about the violence and degradation sex buyers and traffickers perpetrate against the people they buy and sell, whether for power or money or pleasure. But today, I don't want to focus on those men. I want to focus on the men who are standing along so many women, fighting for our rights just as passionately as they would fight for their own. They are proud advocates, and I am thrilled to have them join me today to talk about a central problem in our culture. How do we get more men to step up and be a part of the movement to end sexual exploitation? So, hello, fellas. How are you?
Hello.
Hello.
Everybody's good. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
So, of course, I just want to start with having you all introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are and the work that you do. Cristian, I'll start with you since I'm...
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes. My name is Cristian Eduardo. I'm a survivor of sex and labor trafficking. I have been an advocate for immigrant and LGBTQ plus rights for 9 years. I'm originally from Mexico. I have been living in the United States for 9 years. Now I do policy advocacy, training, and technical assistance, not only in New York, but across the United States. And I do also a lot of support for victims and survivors and peer support for immigrants, people who are just navigating how to really identify if there are victim survivors, and also how to navigate legal systems, education systems, and everything related about being an immigrant and your identity. I also am the co-founder of Mujeres en Resistencia. That is a coalition of immigrants really focused on the Latino Hispanic community. We connect them to services that are free, mainly in the United States. And as you say, it's interesting because most of the victims and survivors that contact us are women. Mm-hmm. Very rarely we get some male and boys, but it's true that most of the victims and survivors that we are able to support are women.
Amazing. Thank you for the work that you do. And we're going to talk a lot about men in this conversation. Alex?
Thank you for having me, Melanie. I'm Alexander Delgado. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Protect All Children from Trafficking. I started my work off in direct services here in New York City, working with survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence. And then I eventually moved to DC to work on more higher level policy in this field. And now at PACT, I help push legislation that will improve our laws to better serve survivors of human trafficking.
Thank you so much for the work that you do as well. And last but not least...
I'm Ali Bien-Aimé, and I work in financial communications at a public relations firm, so nothing, not advocacy, but I've done some advocacy along the way, internships, just helping out at various projects here and there, lobby days or conferences, so I have some exposure to it, but it's not my job.
And I think you're the perfect candidate for this conversation because we want to speak to all the men that are out there, right? Not just the ones that are associated with this issue. So with that, let's jump into that conversation. And before we get into the nuts and bits and crannies, we know already that we're going to be talking about things like trafficking, prostitution, exploitation, but it was very difficult to get 3 men just for this conversation. So I want to start by asking, why did you guys say yes to joining me today? Why engage in this conversation? Anyone can start.
I've always thought it's important that men be part of the solution to this problem because they're part of the problem to begin with.
Love that.
So it's really important that men engage with the issue and talk about it. And as a man myself, that's why I thought it was important that I come in here and share my thoughts.
Thank you, Alex.
A lot of times when we are fighting gender-based violence, when we are fighting violence against women and girls, a lot of times even the same activist, the same advocate is like, they don't want to see male and boys engage. So there's this kind of retaliation, like, you shut up and all these things. And it's like, okay, but I want to engage, and I totally understand. And to be honest, like personally, it really doesn't affect me. And I'm like, yes, I hear you. But I think that it's very important to create these spaces. So on this part, on this side, is like this part that is like, okay, should I take this little space to talk about all this issue, like,
Right.
because it's very important to talk about all the violence and abuse that it's happening, because if we don't engage males, nothing is going to change. Like, a lot of times we are part of the root problem, and if we don't start engaging males, nothing is going to change. So on the other part, when we engage as males in these conversations, there is another retaliation part. The reality is that all the males outside start like retaliating against us. Like, you are against us. Like, you are not a male.
Yeah.
You are weak. You are not strong. Oh, you are gay. You don't belong to us. You don't belong to this community. It's because you only are surrounded by women. So it is very interesting, because I think that a lot of times we want males to be engaged. But, and I'm not saying like, oh, like, of course, like, support all these males that are engaging on this conversation. But it's like, if I'm trying to engage in this world, but it's like I'm going through all this understanding and like kind of re-educating myself, but the only thing that I'm gonna get outside is pain, is like, why should I do it? So, and I think that we never talk about this, you know, and I think that society has always offered males, like, the only way that you can engage with the world is violence, pain, like abusing others. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, but if I try to do the opposite, like, the world is gonna give me the same
same
that
kind
I'm.
of
So
response.
it's we need to start changing that. And I think that nobody wants to talk about it, because it's like, no, we are doing better. But it's like, well, yes, it's a little bit of us that we are doing better, and we need to start having these conversations, because the more we talk about it, the more we're gonna start talking about like, well, yes, it is a very hard path, but you are not alone. Like, and I think that
Yeah.
that's the final message, that you are not alone, and we need to start talking about this.
Cristian is going to give away my show. That's what's about to happen. No. Thank you for that response. And I really, so, okay, first, what I'm hearing both of you say is that men absolutely need to be a part of the conversation. We can't get any solutions to this issue without them. So I'm hearing that in unison. I really love that you brought up this dichotomy of two sides, right? You have, on one hand, you have people that are male that want to talk about the violence, but if they do talk about the violence and come forward, then society will have these negative responses to them. But then if they don't talk about it, or they only respond with violence, there's also negative societal responses to that. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into that dichotomy. Ali, as somebody who is not engaged in advocacy work or in this advocacy work, why did you say yes to this conversation?
Well, first, I mean, it was an opportunity to sort of use my privilege as a guy, because I know people are going to listen more than with women. It's just how it is. And I also expected that you were having trouble finding other guys to do it. It was an opportunity to help, and I thought, okay, they need me, and I wanted to do more, because I feel like I don't do enough. So it's an important issue. And as for the backlash and whatnot, unfortunately, that's just so much of culture now. I mean, I try to think to myself, like, if you're going to get hate no matter what, then try to do something, I suppose.
I really love that, actually. I should get that as a tattoo. Like, if you're gonna get hate anyway, just do it. Like,
True.
And I love your honesty, that you're like, I think you just had trouble finding people, so I'm gonna do it. And I think that is why we're having this conversation, because it's very difficult. So I wanna, before we get into those deep topics or themes, I want to kind of go back to the beginning. Could you guys tell me what your relationships with women were like back then, with your mom, your sister, your auntie, like some of the first relationships that you could remember? What were those like?
Well, I mean, I was raised by two moms, lesbians, and my family is filled with women in sort of positions of leadership or power. I mean, the only grandparent that I have is my grandmother, and she really is like the patriarch of the family. So those were my first relationships, really. I always had sort of strong female role models,
Nice.
like quote unquote wearing the pants or something.
Mm-hmm.
But they also nurtured and took care of their kids, my brother and I. So we had, on the one hand, sort of female role models, like women working, but then we also had women who sort of like took care of us to some extent and, cleaned our room because we were stubborn and wouldn't do that at first. So, eventually we sort of like grew up a little bit and took on more of that. But we sort of had both growing up. And even with feminists in the house and positive female influences and whatnot, I still remember at a young age hearing plenty of sexist messages. I mean, they weren't coming from home, but they did get to me. My mother will famously embarrass me by pointing out that at one point I must have been in maybe elementary school or something. I said that pink was a girl's color and I didn't want to wear it. It gets into you from a young age, your classmates mostly.
And I'm gonna actually circle back to that thought because I think that kind of leads me in the direction that I want to go with this conversation. But first, I want to ask, how do you guys remember what those first women relationships were like with you? Do you remember what it was like with your mom? Do you think that, I'm hearing that your upbringing with your two moms kind of influenced how you view women today?
Heavily.
Heavily influenced. Would you guys say that your first female relationships with women in your life, did that influence how you view women today, or are they not related?
I would say it definitely influences. My dad moved to the U.S. before I was born, so it was my mom and grandma who raised me. And I think living in a household where my mom was working, I think that definitely shaped my view of women and how I interact with women.
Once I start thinking about since I have been a kid, I was surrounded by in that moment I didn't know that it was domestic violence, intimate violence partner, my cousins, committing abuse to their girlfriends, even on my nuclear family, my grandfather to my grandmother, even on my dad and my mother and all these things. But it was very interesting how even at the core of the violence and the abuse, it was always the woman who were taking care of the house, taking care of the finances, the ones who were if there was a big issue, it was always my grandmother, my mom, my uncle, my aunts, the ones who were leading everything. If there was a big issue, it was always the matriarchs. And I was and it was in my mind, I was I don't understand why men are always abusing the woman in my family if they are the ones giving the solutions. It was very interesting for me. Why is this? And of course, I was I didn't have the word power dynamics are happening here and all these things. And I was there's something happening here that I don't understand. And it was very interesting because I was born in Mexico. So I think that since a young age, it was intersecting with me because I never fit the male, ideal. I never liked soccer. I think that my voice never fit my family's standards, the way that I move, the way that I was acting. So the ones that were very welcoming to me, they were always the woman in my families. And they weren't nurturing me in a way that is oh, it's okay. They were no, you need to be strong, because this is gonna continue happening to you. They weren't oh, stay silent and all these things. They were you need to be strong, but they were showing me that without telling me that. And I think that the big thing, it was my mom, that it was never give up, always keep fighting for your things, because there's always good things coming for you. And I think that that's why I was you know what, women are very being oppressed in this world, and in my family and in my house, I have seen it. And once I came out in the world, once I went to college, when I went to Canada and came to the United States, I was oh, wow, it's not only my family, it's the whole society that is doing it. And I was wait. And that's why I started fighting. And I was wait, no, why women are being oppressed in this way? And why nobody's talking about how males were using all this power? Because one thing that is oh, poor males, they are always suffering. They also suffer abuse and all these things. And I'm like, but wait, what? Like, we are always abusing, like, even at home,
Yeah.
we're always abusing women, like, and
Yeah.
nobody's talking about this.
It's the same. I grew up with domestic violence in my household as well. Of course, my mother being the victim of that. And w- it's just interesting to hear like how you internalize it, because we see abuse. We can on one hand view the women being oppressed in that way, and yet on the flip side still see these same women be the matriarchs of the family. And what I'm hearing from all three of you in all of the different upbringings you had is that the women tend to be the matriarchs of your family and have influenced the way you view women today. Ali, you started talking a little bit about how, from a young age you were exposed to sexist messaging around women. I'm curious to know what are some of the messages that you guys grew up with around women? Like, what did you hear about women from back before your advocacy?
I can start.
Yeah,
You know
sure.
that at my home, when my mom moved to my father's family, women weren't allowed to eat at the same time that males.
Jeez.
And sorry about the word, but fuck that. My mom was like, fuck that. Like, my mom was like, I'm gonna sit down. Like, are
And
you all
eat.
crazy? And like, when I hear those stories, I was like, oh, mom, like, that's why I'm the way that I am. My mom say like, are you all crazy? Like, how we are not servants. Like, and a lot of these things were happening at home. Like, women are like to serve the males. Women like cannot raise their boys. Women like shouldn't work. Like, my mom is always telling me like, oh, your dad didn't want me to work. Your dad was like, now you're married with me, like now you're gonna stay at home. Like, and my mom say that it wasn't only my dad, that it was the whole family. That even like my grandma, my aunts were like, oh, you should better like obey and all these things. And my mom was like, what are you talking about? Like, I have been taking care of myself like my whole life, like, and uh, because I marry a male, it doesn't matter that I didn't came here like to
Right,
listen to them.
right.
And it was really a message. And like, it was not only that, like me seeing the abuse, like the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, it was like, I was even scared, like me not fitting like the male idea. I was even scared of myself. I was like, oh my God, like how do I save myself? And like,
Yeah.
it was very, very hard. Like, I think that, and even seeing, I don't know, my other like female cousins, like I don't know if there's a word for that in English, but like female cousins, like how I was like just thinking about like I don't even know if they are gonna make it to adulthood. Like this is horrible. Like how my uncles, they are treating them like slaves. Like my uncles were like, give me food, put my shoes,
Oh
like
my
come
God.
here, like wash my feet and things. And I was like, what? While my cousins, like male cousins, were outside playing football. Like how males, like one of the expectations for me was like have a lot of girlfriends, like, and it was like, oh yes, you have like 5 girlfriends, like wow. And I was like, what is all this craziness that it's happening in my
Yeah.
house? Like, I remember that being a kid, and I was like, I don't want to be an adult. Like, if this is the meaning of being an adult, like treating bad other people, like, I was like, I really don't want to be an adult and be part of this society.
That's actually a very powerful and sad statement and like it should never get to the point where a young boy is exposed to these messages, the way that society views women. We already know that that's in the trash bag at this point, but to be so young and to just come to your own sense and be like, I don't want to, if this is what being an adult is, I don't want to grow up. Like, I think folks need to let that sink in for a second. Alex, what were some of the first, I don't know, messaging or things that you heard about women? Like, did you also have a similar hearing negative messages?
I definitely did as well. I think growing up in Latin America, there was still a lot of machismo, and there still is a lot of machismo. And I probably heard it a lot from my mom and grandma as well. Even though my mom had an education, she was working full time. I think the messaging that I always got was like, well, the women always do everything, and the men just sit down and relax. So I was very spoiled as a child because my mom and grandma would do everything, and that was always something that they always said. You're going to get married, your wife is going to cook, and they're going to want to clean, and then you're going to work. And I think it may have a bit evolved a little because my mom was working, and I think also probably expected
Yeah.
if I was straight and had a wife that she would probably work, but it would also be the expectation that she would also be then who cooks and cleans, and the male wouldn't help around the house just because that wasn't the men's job.
As the only woman sitting here, obviously this is infuriating, but this is our society, right? And Cristian, you had said a little while ago, I realized that it wasn't just in Mexico, it was also here. When you got here too, you saw that this is how women were treated across the nations, right? So this is obviously a large problem. So I want to steer back a little bit to the issue of trafficking, why we're all here today, right? And um, Cristian, I'm going to go to you again. You were somebody who is pretty outspoken, even on this episode, about this issue. And I'm curious to know, were you always comfortable talking about trafficking, or did that come later on?
Oh no, like that was a whole path. Like
Yeah.
I didn't want to talk about trafficking. There was a point in my life that I was like, I don't want to talk about trafficking. I don't want to talk about like any of this. I just want to disappear from the world. But the first reason it was that I discovered that nobody was talking about the trafficking of men and boys. And the other part was that nobody also was talking about the intersections of the LGBTQ plus community, as an immigrant being trafficked, how trafficking intersect with domestic violence, how trafficking intersect with sexual violence. That I don't know why it seems that for a lot of people that trafficking is here and sexual violence is here when they are so interconnected. And the other part is that nobody's talking about sex buyers. I don't know why. I don't know why. I mean, I know why, because we are living in a patriarchal society, because
Yeah.
sex buyers have a lot of power, because sex buyers are living in our families, because sex buyers a lot of times are sitting with us. But nobody's talking about sex buyers. Nobody want to hold accountable sex buyers, and that was one of the big motivations. But one of the big, it was a whole path, to be honest, because to talk about my trafficking experience and being able to do it, I needed to not only disclose my trafficking experience, but I needed to disclose that I was living with HIV, and I needed to disclose that I'm a gay male. So it was a lot of a stigma, because I was like,
Yeah.
oh wow, now I'm going to get retaliation from three sides. It's literally to get out of the closet from three things at the same time. And it happened. Like, a lot of people were like, oh, we thought you were a real man. And I was like, oh, great. Thank you so much. I thought, like, I'm friends from, I have friends that are from pre-K and things like that. I got a lot of message like, oh, like things like, you are so handsome, what a waste of man, like coming for a
jeez.
woman and
Yeah.
things like this. Like, and it was like this retaliation that we were talking at the
Yeah.
beginning. So, and even like living with HIV, like you're a piece of garbage, like you have been killing people, like even with trafficking, it's like, oh no, it's because you like it, because you are gay.
you're gay.
You get HIV
Yeah.
because like you like it to engage in sex and all these things. So it has been very complex as a male coming out and speak about like being a survivor of human trafficking. But I think that it was also a process. And I get the support that I needed, like, to came out and start talking about this. And I kind of got already into the point that I was like, I know the kind of retaliation and the kind of messages that I was reading. And to be honest, today, like, when people get those kind of things to me, I'm like, I'm so sorry. Like, do you want to talk about it? It seems that it's bothering you. Like,
Yeah.
do you want to go to therapy? Do you want me to refer you to a therapist or something like that? So
So
that
a big transition.
Yes. Like,
You know, and I want to say, Cristian, thank you for your bravery. Thank you for sharing with us your personal life's journey. I know that you're a survivor. For those who have not seen the first season of Exit Wound, when the women were talking, we talked a lot about this. Definitely check it out. We talked a lot about buyers and buyer accountability, but we also talked about like the stigmas when you come out, how society views you, things like that. So it's definitely interesting hearing from the male perspective, you know, just hearing like this layered oppression. And we know that prostitution and trafficking intersect with so many other social justice oppressions and crimes and issues, right? But to hear this dual or even triple identity, and all three of the identities have a negative response or backlash from society, that must be really difficult. So I thank you for sharing that. So I want to pose this question to all of you, but Ali, I want to start with you. So I know you guys have agreed to talk with me today about trafficking and prostitution. I know that this is not a topic that most men are usually at the forefront of or come to the table with, but I want to know, do you ever have conversations around this issue, or even just the issue of violence against women, or just violence in general, in casual settings, like if you're going out for a beer or if you just hanging out with the guys? Do you have this conversation when women are not present or advocates are not present?
I do, yeah. I mean, I like heavy conversations.
Yeah.
So when you say casual, like casual for me
That
is a
is
lot
casual,
of
yeah.
politics and philosophy.
Yeah.
And I don't shy away from this issue. It's important to talk about. And that is both with women. And I also know that there's plenty of men who would rather talk about it without women around,
And
just for
you
their
said
comfort
that.
level.
You said you don't shy away from it. So I'm curious to know, why do you think men shy away from this issue? Like, why is this issue so heavily regarded as just a woman's issue? Why do you think that is? And that's for anybody. Why do you guys think that men are not coming to this table?
Well, I think, first of all, of course, it's easier for men to dismiss it if it's called a women's issue. But I also think because we all grew up in a bigoted culture and have seen that this was just acceptable,
Yeah.
both from, celebrities and famous people, but also fathers and people in our personal lives, by the time we get old enough to actually speak about this or have some agency, plenty of people probably already feel guilty about it personally, whether it's because they've engaged in something sexist or, going to a strip club was like a rite of passage for becoming a man.
Still is, unfortunately.
Yeah. So if there's a lot of people who carry guilt into it and don't want to address that, it's very difficult to, and this is not just for feminism, but for every social issue, it's very difficult to sort of say, like, I've done something wrong. I've made a mistake. I was ignorant, and I will now try to learn and do better.
Yeah.
That's uncommon and uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable. And I think that we're trying to break that stigma. We're trying to get through the discomfort, right? We need to find a way to do that.
Yeah.
Do you guys have these conversations outside with friends? Why do you think that this is guarded as a woman's issue? Why are men shying away from this conversation?
I think men shy away from the conversation a lot of times because I think if you're in a male space and then you bring it out, then you automatically become the outlier, and then you become the outsider, and you're no longer part of that club with the other guys. And so I think there's a lot of I don't know if fear is the right word, but fear of being excluded, of not being seen as one of the guys, and I think all of that, the issues that goes into not being seen as one of the guys. What does that mean to that person? Are they gay? Are they weak? They're emotional. And so I think a lot of men are just scared of being labeled.
That's
way.
actually a very good point, because we were talking a little bit earlier, right, about the response that society would give you. And I think for everybody, for men, women, whomever, but also especially for men, I think a lot of the male's identity is based on their club, their friends, their sport of choice, their drink of choice, right? A lot of that kind of appeals to who I am as a man. How strong am I? How many girlfriends do I have? Right? All of those things. So if you, in my personal opinion, if you are a man that decides he wants to speak up, and then you become the outlier, now you're afraid that you are not a man, not strong, the machismo's gone, you don't have all the girlfriends. What do you think?
There's one more layer that I think that is barely talked. Of course, I think that it's one thing. One is that all the normalized behaviors that we have as males. Like, I remember that when I was in college, I usually to be honest, I was very curious to see if other males were like going through domestic violence and all these things in their families, to be honest. But very interesting conversations were coming out. I remember that, and it really stuck to me, because once I started advocating for trafficking and learning more, I was like, oh, wow, we are very bad as society. Because I remember that one big conversation in college between male, it was like, and we were already like 20, 21. It was like, oh, I'm dating this 13-year-old, this 14-year-old. Like, sharing pictures, or like I'm taking their virginity.
That's
or
disgusting.
like the things like, and in that time, I remember that I was like, I think that this is very wrong. I'm like, why would you date a kid, I was like, this is not matching with my idea. And I remember that I was telling them like, cannot you date someone your age? Like, is that difficult?
Yeah.
And all these things like, or like, oh, I had sex with this girl that it was like very drunk at the
Oh my
or
God.
at the party, or like
Yeah.
the welcome party at college, or like, and all these things. And so is this all this behavior that we have normalized, that
Yeah.
we have between males, like, like, or going to the
strip
club,
club,
like,
yeah.
all the strip club and all these things. I remember that one of my jobs in Mexico, like, my boss took me to a stripper club, and I clearly remember that he took a bunch of us to the strip club because I was working in engineering, and a dancer like sat down with me, and I started like talking with her, and my boss was like, "Oh, I thought you were gay," and I was like, what is happening here? And it's very interesting because what ended up happening was like, of course, start asking her like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Like, and all these things. And to be honest, like, as a gay male, like, in a lot of LGBT spaces, like, there are a lot of strippers. And usually, like, it's what I ended up doing when I'm drinking. Like, I start asking like, oh, what are you doing here? And all these things. So
Yeah.
it's one part, all these like normalized
Yeah.
behaviors that are really like, or they are already like abuse
Yeah.
on itself, or are on like the fine line or abuse that is like, it really depends a lot on the context, or it really depends on the law
Yeah.
on each like country or state.
Yeah.
And on the other part, one very interesting thing that it has happening since I'm very open about trafficking is that a lot of males start opening up about sexual violence that they have experienced from their family members, a lot of the physical violence that they have experienced, domestic violence, and that they had never talked about it, or that they
Yeah.
had never had the space. And I would like to give a big example, like teachers. I think that teachers in primary school abusing like male students, like how that is celebrated, like, oh, you have sex with the teacher? Oh,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
so sexy. Like,
Yeah.
yes, you became a male, like, ooh. And it's like, no, you were sexual abused.
I'm
Like,
curious with the friend or whomever that you spoke to that said, "Oh, I'm texting this girl who's 13, 14." How did they respond when you asked them, "Can you date somebody your own age?"
they were like, oh, that's totally normal.
Wow.
No, I'm not
Yeah.
kidding. Like, like, but coming back a little bit about like all the violence that a lot of male experience, I think that is this denial of
Yeah.
like, because it's something that you were saying, and I think that it's very, very tied to machismo, to the society
Yeah.
that we are living. It's like, if I recognize that I was harmed in one point in my life, that means that I'm weak. That means that I'm not strong. And that means that I'm not male enough to live in this society. So I think that it's very, very connected, because you put it under the rock only. And it came out like in a form of violence against like
Yeah.
the people that are around you. So I think that we never address all these things also.
In society we don't, and I think we're all trying to now figure out how can we create these paths, right? We need to find the solutions. Ali, I think you are the youngest person here on this conversation. So I want to ask you, because one thing as a millennial that I hear a lot is that, oh, Gen Z, the new generation, they're so good at fighting for what's right and standing up and are being progressive. Do you think that age and generations play a role in this, in everything? Do you think that you see generations playing a role in who's harming? And do you think that there's a difference in the generations in how we talk about this issue?
I think there is, but it's more about sort of access to technology or the media and culture that raised us more than age itself.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of people who are older but sort of know the lingo or something because they're on the internet a lot. I mean,
Right.
I don't actually do any social media, so I can't keep up with a lot of the language now. But I still have sort of other channels of kind of learning this stuff. Younger generations have the internet. They've heard a wider range of voices. Some of that means disinformation. Some of that means hearing people who otherwise would never have made it onto any kind of sort of mainstream radio or television, back when it was black and white, for instance.
Yeah.
So there's just more opportunity. I don't know whether or not future generations are going to be more progressive or better at protesting or anything.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, and they may get less progressive as they grow up. That's always a possibility.
Yeah.
But I do think that hearing a wider range of voices has a positive impact, and it's going to be hard to roll that back. So
Yeah.
I think that at least in the way it's discussed, something like sort of feminism or sexism, it's not going to go away, but there may be changes in sort of how it manifests, how they manifest.
I do think, I mean, personally, I think there's some differences generationally. And I do think technology is a big piece of this. And I know something that's like a big hot topic right now in this movement is talking about how tech plays a role in exploitation, right? So I know everyone's on TikTok. I still don't have a TikTok. I'm a little embarrassed to say, but I still don't have a TikTok, right? But a lot of people get misinformation from TikTok, but then also use it to spread not just misinformation or any information about trafficking, but they also use it to spread messages of machismo, of toxic masculinity, or how to combat toxic masculinity, right? And it's interesting. So last week we held a roundtable with all women survivors, and we asked them a whole bunch of questions about this issue. We're trying to all come together, put our heads together to fight this issue. And one of the questions that we asked was what I asked you: why do you think men are shying away from the issue? And what was very interesting about the roundtable is that none of the women had an answer. Nobody can say any guesses, any thoughts about why men are straying away from this issue. So I wanted to ask you all, how do you think that we can get men to care about violence against women and marginalized people in any form? What can we do? You know, some of them already may care, but they're not really vocal about caring. Like you said, a lot of men don't like to speak up. Right. So why do you think that men are hesitating to speak up? And do you think it's something that women are doing? Do you think it's something society is doing? And I know earlier you said that, you know, when I asked why do you think that this is regarded as a woman's issue, you said in part it's because we call it a woman's issue, right? So do you think that the language has a part to play, or do you think men are shying away from something else? And I want to start with you, Alex.
I think a big part of it has to do with ignorance and just not being educated on the issue. I mean, I think something that we should be teaching from a very young age is healthy relationships and consent. And I think when that is not being taught and not being socialized when you're younger, I think a lot of men don't even know where to start, or maybe just scared to make a mistake, or when they're talking about the issue. Because I feel like one of the bad things that came out of the Me Too movement was this idea that like, poor men are going to be wrongly accused of things, and like that's going to be issue, even though it does not happen. The wrong accusations, false accusations is almost very, very minimum, to almost non-existent. So I think that has a part to play with it.
I think it really comes down to identity. I mean, if you were raised to define your sense of self-worth on your gender, then hearing any kind of criticism of something that men disproportionately do, or something that is described as men do this or men suck or whatever it may be, you're going to get defensive. And so I think part of it is just trying to help people build a sense of identity that is separated from something that shallow. So that when we discuss those issues, it doesn't feel like a personal attack. Right. Even if the man hasn't actually done anything even remotely sexist, it can still probably feel that way.
Right. That's going back to that ignorance point you were saying.
And just to add to that, I think the reason why it could be so personal is because sexism, violence against women is so ingrained into our society. I feel like if you're a man, it does become a part of you. I think it was a part of me, and it's a part of all of us. And it takes a lot of work to separate yourself, and work on understanding how the patriarchy and sexism has affected you. That usually probably requires like therapy and like talking about it. And so,
and that's something men typically don't subscribe to.
Exactly.
Right?
They're not going to therapy and they're not talking about these issues. And so they never end up working out how it is so ingrained and has become a part of them, and how to address it even.
Christian, earlier you when I said, "Oh, I think you're gonna take over my show," it's because of this next question actually reminds me of something that you were talking about earlier. You mentioned briefly that usually when the men do respond, that it's usually with violence, right? And something that came up in the roundtable with the women was that either no men at all are speaking up about this issue, or for the few that do, it's never to be vocal about the abuse or to fight for what's right in a press conference per se, right? It's usually that they want to resort to violence. They want to either, and I heard this a lot from the women last week. They said, the men in my life, either I didn't tell them about me being abused or being exploited, or for the men that did care about me, when I told them I was being exploited, they just wanted to beat up the sex buyer or they just wanted to beat up the pimp. Why do you think that is, Christian? And how do any of you handle those feelings of anger when you feel like you want to punch somebody in the face, when you feel like you want, if you feel like you want to punch somebody in the face, but why do you think men automatically are drawn to that as a response, as opposed to something like therapy, as opposed to something like, I don't know, peaceful mediation or something like that?
I would say that because any other reaction is associated with don't being a male. And I think even this idea, like the alpha male, that it's also disproven that also wolves don't have like an alpha male.
Yeah.
Also, like all these ideas that there's like the alpha or like that aggression is the main component in society to thrive. And it's like, well, we are not living in caves anymore. Like we don't need it's like this component of force is not the main thing to survive anymore. Like we are living in community, we're social, like all these things. And I think that, but also as a society, we have been, it's interesting. I think that, and I have seen it, that when a man, just in society in general, show themselves as soft and all these things, not only men, but also a lot of times women have, and I think that this is the part that people need to understand, that machismo affect not only women, but men and women, and both. Like if you don't fit the perfect ideal idea of machismo, it's gonna affect you. Like because a lot of times it's like they are not gonna hear you. Like literally they are not gonna hear you. Like even if in a round table of males, the male who looks more dominant is the one that they are gonna follow. And it's like, why we are doing this? Like this is nonsense in 2024.
And that goes back to our society, how we view men, what we think, what's ingrained as what men are supposed to look like: strong, athletic, bodybuilder types, right? Like, and then anybody else that identifies as male that doesn't fit that physical description, then automatically you're kind of put to the side or put in with the girls, which brings me, as we're drawing to a close on this episode, I want to ask all of you, because this is something that I think I heard you mention in your remarks earlier. Just this idea that, since you're a gay male, then this issue that's why you care about this issue, or like that's why it's important to you, or that's why you're okay with talking about it. So I want to know, why is it that society sees this, the saying, like the girls and the gays, we've always been associated with each other for a while, right? And I want to know, like, when it comes to this issue, why do you think that it's women and gay men that are the ones to take up this particular social issue? And why do straight men in your minds typically ignore this issue? I know we talked a little bit about why, straight men are shy away from this issue, but why do you think that gay men are quicker to join women in this fight?
I mean, we're lumped in together. The solidarity sort of forms itself. If you're sort of kicked out of whatever group you're supposedly a part of, like, people think of you as like a straight guy, and then suddenly you're not, you're going to wind up with women, and you're going to wind up having solidarity there. That I think that bond just sort of forms as a response.
Naturally.
Yeah, naturally.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like, in middle school, none of the guys were hanging out with me. I was friends with all the girls. And that just kind of became community. I feel I'm definitely much more comfortable being around women than I would be around straight men. Like, I think I definitely know that I'm sometimes still going to work at it to be around straight men, to
like
not feel
yeah.
to not be awkward.
Do you guys think that gay men and straight men care about this issue differently, or do you think it's just because society pushed gay men to be in women's spaces? Or do you think that straight men care about trafficking of people less than gay men? Or do you think it's just that we just tend to be with each other because of these physical differences, or because you don't have a deep voice or something like that?
I mean, I wouldn't really think of gay men as caring about this issue on a sort of broader scale. I mean,
interesting.
maybe as individuals, but
Yeah.
just generally, I wouldn't say it necessarily comes up. I mean, chances are if you're marginalized, you may be more inclined to listen to others who are marginalized, or to be more open-minded to that. So that probably helps in a way that straight men can't really relate to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, gay men are still men. I don't think, or I guess I haven't gotten the sense that generally this was an issue that gay men sort of collectively cared about.
And that's honest. And I think I appreciate you saying that, because a lot of men, at least in my life that I've spoken to, when I try to approach them with this issue, or with any issue that has to do with sexual assault, rape, any of that, either they don't want to hear it, or when I call them out and say, men are majority of the problem or the perpetrators, it's always like, well, I would never. It's always, they go into defense mode. And I think you mentioned earlier, like sometimes they could be ashamed or feel guilty by the time that they actually feel inclined or compelled to say something about that. So thank you for that honesty. This was a really fruitful and heartful conversation, and we can go on for hours about this. So I want to kind of transition to our last words here, at least for now. So I want to ask you all, and Cristian, I'll start with you. If men were to listen to just 1 minute of this podcast, or this episode in particular, what would you want them to know?
I wanted to know that if you have been through abuse, to violence, that it's totally valid, that it wasn't your fault, but also that doesn't justify that you are harming other people. You deserve support, you deserve services, you deserve to be heard, but that doesn't justify that you are harming other people. And also on the other side, I want to remind all males that even if you have a partner, even if you say that you have gay friends, black friends, that you are that you respect women, like that you can still be machista, misogynist, homophobic, racist. So, and even like other gay males, like I just want to remind everyone that they can be homophobic. So there's a lot of work to do. Don't sit down. I think that there's a lot of work to do, like in male spaces. And for males, it's very, very important to recognize our privilege. It doesn't take you anything. You're not going to be less male than 1 minute before. To recognize that you're a male, that there's some privilege on it, that it doesn't mean that you're going to be rich. It doesn't mean that life is going to be 100% easier for you, but the reality is that some steps you're going to be able to jump them. So it's real, it's happening, and if you haven't noticed it, it's because you have benefits from it.
Alex?
I think I would like to remind men that gender violence, sexism, all of this is a women's issue, but it's also a societal issue that that harms men as well, and that it's important to look at the cost of what it means to be in a patriarchal society. I think we talked about before, like sometimes the only emotion that a man has is happiness and anger, and that's it. And they don't get the chance to express the whole spectrum of human emotions. And I would encourage men to look at that and start exploring what that means to get in touch with your feelings. And I think when you start doing that, then I think the empathy will come along with it, because then you'll really understand, like, maybe when, like, I think you were saying, like, the first response to someone disclosing sexual violence was anger, but maybe what you're really feeling is not actually anger, but it's sadness. And you don't know that because you haven't ever explored your emotions before, or looked at the world in that way, and that can be really, really harmful. So look at how the patriarchy really affects you negatively. And I think once men start doing that, then they will start to see that the cost of power is much greater, much worse than any of its benefits.
Thank you.
I would say that we're all raised in a sexist society, and I wouldn't expect any individual not to be. But we're all responsible for our choices and the messages and impact that we have going forward. So you get to decide what you want to do and who you want to be. We're all more than just our gender, but we're also, you're also not less of a man just because you try to sort of be less sexist or try to be more in touch with your feelings or something. I mean, your identity is up to you, and so are your actions. So this is the world we live in, but you can try to do better.
100%. And that's on period. I don't have to add anything after that. Thank you all for joining me for this really important conversation, and thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Doing this work, it's really easy to slip into thinking, God, all men are terrible, men suck. But of course, that's not true. There are so many examples of good men, including you three. And when I say good, I don't mean perfect. I don't mean holy or being pure or kind. I mean good in the sense that you all view women and marginalized people as full human beings, and that's important. But we need more men to show us. We need you to speak up for the so-called women's issue and make clear that this is a human rights issue. No man should be able to pay for access to a woman's body. Prostitution cannot be our solution to an unequal society. And I think that there are many of you out there who agree. We cannot make change with half of the population staying silent. Thank you for listening and watching. You can find more episodes of Exit Wound wherever you get your podcast, YouTube, or at exitwoundpodcast.com. Until next time.